So if you look at the multi-billion-dollar empires of modern fantasy and horror today, I mean, think about the expansive worlds of Stephen King, or the cinematic universes of Marvel, or even the sprawling lore of Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Absolutely massive empire.
Right.
You would naturally assume they were built on this really solid marble foundation of high literature, you know?
Yeah.
Like you picture this grand, sturdy architecture carefully laid out by visionaries with endless resources.
Yeah, well, it's a very natural assumption to make. I mean, we really want to believe that these culture-defining institutions have these pristine, super intentional origins. But if you actually dig into the foundational landscape of early speculative fiction, that marble cornerstone completely vanishes. And what you find instead is basically a leaky, rotting wooden raft.
The wooden raft.
Yeah, literally held together by cheap glue, sheer desperation, and this incredibly chaotic cast of characters.
Yeah. Which honestly sounds like a complete structural nightmare. But somehow, against all odds, that leaky raft didn't just stay afloat. It birthed entire genres. So welcome to this deep dive. Today our mission is to explore how a perpetually broke, very cheaply printed pulp magazine called Weird Tales managed to forge modern fantasy, horror, and sci-fi.
It really is a wild story.
It is. And more importantly, we want to look at why its incredibly messy, highly controversial history still actually shapes the media landscape that you and I consume today.
And to do this, we're pulling from a remarkably comprehensive Wikipedia history that maps out the entire lifespan of Weird Tales. We're pairing that with a really fantastic resource excerpt from Open Culture.
Which I love, by the way.
Oh, it's great. That second source is especially awesome because it details how you can actually go online and download original, pristine scans of these magazines right now.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Weird Tales wasn't just a publication. It functioned as this crucible. It was this bizarre forge that gave a voice to legendary creators who, frankly, quite literally had nowhere else to publish their wildest, most unmarketable ideas.
Nowhere at all.
But to really understand how it got there, we have to start at the genesis of the pulp magazine itself, and a launch that was, well, an absolute disaster.
It really was a spectacular failure right out of the gate. But let's set the stage first. So if we go back to 1896, the Frank A. Munsey Company shifted their magazine, which was called Argosy, to printing only fiction.
Yeah.
And to cut costs and maximize volume, they started printing on this incredibly cheap, untreated wood pulp paper.
And that is literally where the term pulp magazine comes from. We aren't talking about nice, glossy paper here.
Oh, definitely not.
This was thick, acidic paper that had this very specific smell, and it would quite literally yellow and crumble into dust if you just left it sitting out in the sun. It was an entirely disposable medium.
Exactly. I mean, it was built for pure volume. So for a few decades, these pulps were just massive collections of general fiction. But by the early 1900s, publishers started to realize they could segment the market. They could target very specific, dedicated niches.
Which makes sense.
Yeah, so you start seeing things like Railroad Man's Magazine. Then Detective Story Magazine hits the stands in 1915. Western Story Magazine follows in 1919. Publishers were finding these highly captive audiences.
But if you looked at a newsstand in, say, 1922, there was this glaring gap. You had all these stories about science fiction, fantasy, and the supernatural floating around, but they were usually getting rejected or shoved into the back pages of general fiction magazines.
Yeah, they were totally marginalized.
Right. There was no single publication dedicated exclusively to the weird, because the major publishers considered those genres either too uncommercial or just too unsavory.
And enter a man named J.C. Henneberger. So he was a massive fan of Edgar Allan Poe, and he saw this gap in the market not just as a business opportunity, but really as a literary crusade.
A crusade, I like that.
Yeah, he wanted to launch a magazine that gave writers free rein to express their innermost bizarre feelings in a way he genuinely felt befitted great literature. So in March 1923, he launches Weird Tales, and he gives it this very ambitious subtitle, The Unique Magazine.
It's a really noble mission. The guy wants to create a haven for the outcasts of literature. The problem is his execution, because Henneberger isn't going to edit the magazine himself. He needs to hire an editor. And he taps a guy named Edwin Baird.
Which is where the entire operation immediately goes off the rails.
Totally. To put this in perspective for you, hiring Edwin Baird to run the world's first dedicated magazine for bizarre, boundary-pushing horror is like It's like opening an experimental gourmet burger joint and then hiring a strictly vegan head chef.
That is exactly what it was like.
Right. There's a fundamental mismatch of product and leadership.
And the inevitable result of that mismatch is that Baird just leans on what he knows, which was traditional crime fiction. He actually disliked horror stories.
Which is wild for the editor of Weird Tales.
I know. He just didn't understand the psychological dread or the cosmic terror that this new wave of weird writers were trying to explore. So the avant-garde writers Henneberger was hoping to attract, well, they either didn't submit anything or they were completely turned off by Baird.
Yeah.
So Baird ended up filling the early issues of the magazine with these incredibly bland, traditional ghost stories. We're talking stories narrated by someone in a lunatic asylum or told in a deeply boring diary format.
Not exactly the groundbreaking, mold-shattering weird fiction they were promising on the cover.
No, not at all.
And Baird's editorial style was just baffling when he was dealing with eccentric authors. Like, he famously alienated a young, completely unknown H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh, this story's crazy.
It is. So Lovecraft actually sent in 5 stories, and Baird liked them enough to buy them, but he refused to just print them as they were. He literally forced Lovecraft to resubmit all of them as double-spaced typed manuscripts.
Which just highlights a total misunderstanding of the talent he was dealing with. I mean, Lovecraft was notoriously eccentric. He considered himself this sort of aristocratic gentleman of letters, and he absolutely hated typing.
Hated it.
Yeah, so out of spite, or maybe just pure exhaustion with Baird's whole pulp factory mentality, Lovecraft initially only resubmitted a single story, which was Dagon.
So you literally have the vegan chef rejecting the best meat in town just because it isn't plated correctly.
Exactly.
And because Baird lacked that specific vision for the outre, readers just didn't care about the magazine. It hemorrhaged money. After just 13 issues, the magazine was in debt by up to $60,000. And in 1924, for a cheap pulp operation, that is an apocalyptic amount of money.
It was essentially a death sentence. That $60,000 debt meant they had to pivot, and pivot hard just to survive. So Henneberger reorganized the company. Baird was unceremoniously ousted. Right. And because the magazine was basically a sinking ship, control was handed over to a man who likely wouldn't have even gotten the job under normal, healthy circumstances. But he's the man who would go on to truly define the genre.
Farnsworth Wright. And here's where it gets really interesting. Wright takes over as editor in 1924, and he ushers in what historians widely consider the golden age of weird tales, which was an era lasting until about 1940.
Ah.
And the most incredible part of this, he did all of this while suffering from severe Parkinson's disease. It was a condition that progressively robbed him of his ability to even sign his own name.
Wright was the visionary the magazine desperately needed. I mean, his sheer force of will is astounding. He couldn't physically write, so he dictated, he talked, he engaged in endless dialogue with his authors.
Wow.
Yeah, he was the one who began publishing the absolute heavy hitters of the field. He brought Lovecraft back into the fold, famously debuting the shared Cthulhu mythos with the Call of Cthulhu in 1928.
Which we actually need to pause and explain. Because today, the idea of a shared universe, like the Marvel Cinematic Universe, is completely normal to us. We expect it.
Oh, yeah, it's everywhere.
But in 1928, the concept of a shared mythos in a pulp magazine was completely revolutionary.
It totally changed the mechanics of fandom. Lovecraft wasn't just writing isolated ghost stories anymore. He was building this cohesive, terrifying universe with its own ancient gods and forbidden books like the Necronomicon and these forbidden locations.
Right.
And Wright encouraged other authors to use those same gods and books in their own stories. So suddenly, if you were a reader, you couldn't just skip an issue. You had to buy every single copy of Weird Tales just to piece together this massive, terrifying puzzle.
It was early world building on just a massive scale. And Wright didn't stop there. He published Robert E. Howard, who introduced the world to Conan the Barbarian, right there in those pages. He published C.L. Moore, a pioneering female author whose famous story, Shamblu, was so well received by Wright that he allegedly closed the editorial office for the rest of the day just to celebrate its arrival.
The roster of raw talent is just staggering. But what I really love about this era is the chaotic, highly unglamorous reality of how these stories were actually produced. For instance, Wright brokered a deal where Lovecraft ghost wrote a story for the famous escape artist Harry Houdini.
Yes, imprisoned with the pharaohs.
Exactly.
Oh, this is one of my absolute favorite details from the deep dive. So Lovecraft had the final typed manuscript for this high-profile Houdini story, and he took it with him on a train to New York on his actual wedding day.
Which is already a bad idea.
Terribly bad idea.
Mm.
And he left it on the train. It was gone. So he spent a significant portion of his wedding day sweating in his suit, frantically retyping the entire story from his handwritten notes just to meet Wright's deadline. I mean, can you imagine that stress?
It perfectly captures that frantic, fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants energy of the pulp era. It wasn't high art happening in these quiet mahogany libraries, you know? It was desperate people sweating over typewriters.
Exactly.
And it wasn't just genre writers cutting their teeth there either. Tennessee Williams, the legendary playwright who would go on to write A Streetcar Named Desire, he made his very first professional sale to Weird Tales with a story called The Vengeance of Nitocris in 1928.
But despite having Lovecraft inventing cosmic horror and Conan the Barbarian hacking things to pieces and Tennessee Williams just wandering through the pages, none of them were actually the most popular writer in the magazine at the time.
Not even close. The most popular writer, the guy who actually kept the lights on for the readers, was a man named Seabury Quinn.
Seabury Quinn.
Yeah, he wrote this wildly successful ongoing detective series about a supernatural investigator named Jules de Grandin. For the average reader, that was the absolute bread and butter of the magazine.
Okay, wait, hold on. I have to push back here for a second. You're calling Farnsworth Wright this legendary visionary curator of the weird. But if you look at the timeline, Wright actually rejected The Call of Cthulhu the first time Lovecraft submitted it.
He did.
He also rejected Lovecraft's massive masterpiece, At the Mountains of Madness. So I have to ask, how is Wright a genius curator if he is initially tossing out the exact stories that would go on to define the magazine's entire legacy?
It's a crucial point, and honestly, it looks crazy in hindsight. But this highlights the difference between an omniscient visionary and a working editor. Wright had to balance these groundbreaking, bizarre ideas with cold, hard commercial survival.
Right.
So when Lovecraft submitted a sprawling, serialized novel like At the Mountains of Madness, Wright had to do the math. Paying for a massive serial meant tying up cash they frankly didn't have and taking a massive risk on whether the readers could even stomach it.
Right, because if the readers hate part 1, you're stuck printing parts 2, 3, and 4 while your sales just completely plummet.
Exactly. But Wright's real genius wasn't a flawless first read. It was his willingness to change his mind. He would reject a story, discuss it with the author, tell them exactly why it didn't work for the current budget or the current audience, and then he'd buy it later when the time was right.
That makes sense.
Yeah, that flexibility, that ongoing dialogue, it allowed a unique Weird Tales school of writing to form. He nurtured his writers' weirdness rather than punishing them for it like Bear did.
But words on a page, even genius words nurtured by a great editor, weren't going to save them on the newsstand. The physical reality of the magazine was a huge hurdle, because Weird Tales charged 25 cents an issue during this golden age.
Which is a lot.
It was incredibly high when most competing pulps were selling for a dime. So to justify a 25-cent price tag, they needed a visual identity so striking that it practically grabbed you by the collar right off the shelf.
And this reveals a fascinating mechanism of how pulp magazines actually operated. Because the visual aesthetic didn't just market the magazine, it actively dictated the narrative content the authors were producing.
Okay, yes. The prime example of this mechanism in action is Margaret Brundage. She was the most famous cover artist for Weird Tales throughout the 1930s, and she was known almost exclusively for painting these ethereal, highly provocative nudes.
Yes.
And because she was moving copies, she was paid $90 a cover, which was fantastic money. Now, remember Seabury Quinn, the Jules de Grandin author who was their most popular writer?
Oh, yeah, the guy writing the reliable bread-and-butter detective stories.
Right. Quinn realized very quickly that stories featuring female characters in various states of undress were the ones getting selected for Brundage's premium cover art. So what does he do? He intentionally starts writing scenes where his heroines just inexplicably shed their clothes for basically no narrative reason, solely to secure that cover spot.
Yes, and to take that a step further, it's wild because Quinn was essentially manipulating a physical algorithm in the 1930s.
It is exactly like modern YouTube creators. You know how YouTubers will optimize their clickbait thumbnails, making crazy faces or using neon colors? And they will literally script the first 30 seconds of their video just to match a thumbnail they know the algorithm will favor.
Yes.
Quinn was doing pulp-era thumbnail optimization just to get eyeballs on his stories.
That is exactly what he was doing. And the art department wasn't just relying on sensationalism either. They also brought in Virgil Finlay, who was an absolute master of delicate, intricate stippling and cross-hatching.
His art is amazing.
It's beautiful. Finlay's art was so detailed that Wright actually had to run a specialized test print just to see if Finlay's fine lines could even survive being printed on cheap, highly absorbent pulp paper.
Because if you print fine lines on cheap, untreated wood pulp, the ink usually just bleeds into a giant, messy ink blot, right?
Exactly. The paper acts like a sponge. But Finlay's technique was so perfectly calibrated that it worked. It looked stunning, and he became a staple, making $100 a cover.
But the economics of pulp art eventually caught up with him, and it took a very dark turn. Later on in the timeline, the magazine was sold to a publisher named William Delaney, and he came in and drastically slashed the budgets. Art rates were brutally cut in half, down to $50 a cover.
Wow.
Yeah, and the mechanism here is simple. When you cut pay that drastically, you cut quality. So Weird Tales eventually became a market of last resort for artists, resulting in some truly terrible, amateurish illustrations.
And this is where we start to see the structural integrity of that leaky raft really give way. I mean, for a magazine selling the weird and the supernatural, atmosphere is everything. The visual aesthetic is half the battle in convincing the reader to suspend their disbelief.
Totally.
Once you lose that high-quality art, you lose the atmosphere. And losing its identity was something Weird Tales would deeply struggle with as it moved into its later years, largely due to the controversies it courted and the fierce competition it inevitably inspired.
Because pushing both visual and narrative boundaries is always a double-edged sword. You attract a fiercely dedicated readership, but you also crash directly into the cultural guardrails.
Right.
We see this early on with a story by C.M. Eddy Jr. called The Love Dead. It heavily featured themes of necrophilia. The reaction was so severe that, according to the author, the story allegedly got the entire magazine banned and pulled from newsstands across the state of Indiana.
And while some modern historians debate the strict factual reality of that statewide ban, the perception of intense, dangerous controversy was absolutely real.
It wasn't just horror either. They pushed social and political boundaries too. In another incident, author E. Hoffman Price wrote a biting satire of the Ku Klux Klan. And when a Klan member read the story and canceled their subscription in anger, Farnsworth Wright openly defended publishing it.
It did.
Wright argued that controversy was actually good for circulation, and that it was entirely worth the loss in revenue to intentionally provoke and alienate bigots.
He understood that if your title is the unique magazine, you have to constantly live up to that name, even if it makes your readership deeply uncomfortable. But ultimately, the real threat to the magazine wasn't social controversy, it was mainstream competition. By the late 1930s and into the 1940s, the very genres that Weird Tales had nurtured in the dark were suddenly stepping into the light.
Right. They weren't the only game in town anymore. You had slicker, better-funded magazines like Unknown coming onto the scene. They were offering higher pay rates, and they started aggressively scooping up the best talent that Weird Tales had originally discovered.
And Farnsworth Wright, the man holding it all together, saw his health rapidly fail. In 1940, he was let go. Dorothy McIlwraith took over as editor. Now, she was an incredibly experienced editor, but she was handed an absolutely impossible hand to play. The publisher, Delaney, was already slashing her budgets, and then World War II hits.
Which brings massive, nationwide paper shortages.
Exactly. The physical mechanism of the magazine begins to literally shrink. The page count drops. The actual physical dimensions of the magazine are reduced. And when you shrink the page size on cheap pulp paper, any remaining intricate art turns into those muddy ink blots we talked about.
Right.
The visual atmosphere is completely destroyed.
And because McIlwraith couldn't pay top dollar, the legendary established authors who built the magazine's reputation left for greener, better-paying pastures. She genuinely tried to pivot, and she did an amazing job discovering a new generation of talent. I mean, she published early works by literary giants like Ray Bradbury and Richard Matheson.
Which is huge.
It is, but it was a losing battle against a fundamentally declining pulp industry. The original historic run of Weird Tales finally folded its tent in September 1954.
But the brand didn't just quietly fade into the ether. Over the ensuing decades, Weird Tales saw numerous revivals. It changed hands between various publishers, shifting formats from traditional pulps to paperbacks to independent zines. I mean, everyone wanted to recapture that 1920s golden age magic.
But what's fascinating is that even in the modern era, the magazine never lost its dangerous habit of crashing into those cultural guardrails. In 2012, under editor Marvin Kaye, The magazine published an excerpt from a novel called Save the Pearls.
Yes.
The publication immediately drew heavy criticism from readers and critics who accused the story of featuring racist stereotyping. The decision to publish it created such a massive industry backlash that the magazine's previous editor, Anne Vandermeer, publicly resigned and severed her ties with the publication entirely.
It was a huge moment.
Yeah, it proves that the DNA of pushing boundaries, sometimes with disastrous, highly offensive results, never really left the publication. Even decades later, it was still testing the limits of what an audience deemed acceptable.
Which really brings us back to the overarching arc of this entire history. When we look at this massive timeline, from the staggering $60,000 debt in 1923 to the brilliant pivot under Wright, to the painful fold in 1954, what really killed the golden age of weird tales.
Yeah, what does this all mean? Did Weird Tales die because it made terrible business decisions, like slashing art budgets and alienating its own talent? Or was it simply a victim of its own wild success? Did it normalize the weird so effectively that mainstream, better-funded competitors just arrived, built a better raft, and scooped up their audience?
If you look at the mechanics of the publishing industry, it's undeniably the latter. Weird Tales functioned as an incubator. It was a nexus point for speculative fiction when literally nobody else would touch it. But once the genres of fantasy, horror, and science fiction matured, they splintered into other successful, highly specialized publications.
Makes sense.
Yeah, Weird Tales proved to the major publishers that the audience existed, and once that was proven, bigger fish simply came in and ate their lunch. They fundamentally lost their unique niche because the rest of the world caught up to them.
It is the absolute classic pioneer's dilemma. You take all the risk, you hack a bloody path through the uncharted jungle, and then someone else comes along, pays a highway over your path, and charges a toll.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But that pioneer status is why we still talk about them today. That doesn't diminish the fact that without this messy, chaotic, financially unstable pulp magazine, the modern pop culture landscape, the movies we watch, the massive books we read, would look entirely different. They prove that if you give eccentric, unpolished authors free rein to explore the bizarre and the unpublishable, you can literally change the trajectory of literature forever.
And the absolute best part of this deep dive is that you don't just have to take our word for it. As we mentioned at the top of the show, our open culture source points out that this history isn't locked away in some dusty, inaccessible museum vault. Right now, you can go online and download the original January 1926 issue featuring H.P. Lovecraft's The Tomb, or the August 1926 issue featuring The Terrible Old Man.
It's so cool.
It is. You can actually flip through those digital pages, zoom in on the intricate bleeding line art on that cheap paper, read the wild letters to the editor, and experience this crucible of modern fantasy firsthand.
It is a phenomenal, tangible way to connect with the raw, highly unpolished origins of the sleek stories we consume today.
It really is. It bridges a century of pop culture right on your screen. Which leaves me with a final thought for you to mull over. If Weird Tales succeeded precisely because it gave writers a place to publish unpublishable, off-trail, deeply weird ideas in the 1920s, where is the true equivalent for creators today? In an era of algorithm-driven content where almost everything is hyper-optimized for immediate clicks, maximum retention, and broad demographic appeal, where does the truly unpublishable, commercially unviable weirdness go to find its audience? Are we building new marble cornerstones in the digital age? Or are we still just looking for the next leaky wooden raft willing to chart unknown waters?